All right, high school class, we're going to go over our notes for Bible. Just want to go over a overview, really, of the life of Solomon. Obviously, we've gone through both the first two kings of Israel at this point. We went over Saul, and we talked a little bit about how, just as review, we talked about how Saul was, a very tall, handsome, strong guy, and the nation of Israel, out of a desire to be like other nations, rather than following God, they wanted their own king to follow. So Saul was elected, and he did pretty well to start out. He was following God. He was leading Israel well. People looked up to him. They respected him, but his heart started to drift from God, and eventually he died, and David became king. David would have been the second king over the nation of Israel. And we just looked at his life this last week. And so we know that God was able to take a little shepherd boy and turn him into a powerful and well-respected man who the Bible says that David had a heart after, or was a man after God's own heart. And so that's a high compliment right there. And so he would have been the second king. And then right now we're going to be looking at the life of Solomon. Now the life of Solomon is interesting because whereas with Saul you have basically he starts out well and then he drifts and he never really gets right with God. Then you have David, who really just does a pretty good job all the way through. Yes, he has major sins, things like Bathsheba, family problems, but he is, for the most part, constantly trying to do right, trying to follow God. But then you get to the life of Solomon, and it's a little bit different. So I'm going to give you just a little bit of background information on Solomon, and then we're going to look at two primary things that we need to focus on, just like we did with David. So grab your Bibles and follow along. We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 10. Now, this is a disclaimer. I preached this text a while back, so I'm actually going to be talking to you from my sermon notes, which is why the format looks a little bit odd. You don't have to understand all of my outlines and everything that I've put in here. That's fine. But you just need to pay attention and make sure that you're taking notes as well, okay? But we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 10. While you're headed over there, you can either pause the video or you can just listen up. So we know that David is no longer king. Solomon was, and Solomon was given a very unique opportunity that not really anyone has been given. But basically, God told Solomon, you can ask for anything, and I'm going to give it to you. And so Solomon has opportunity to basically ask for anything. He can ask for a city that will never be destroyed. He could ask for his name to be remembered forever. He could ask for unlimited money. And so one of the things that I want you to include in your notes, if you could ask God for anything, what would you ask him for? It's a good question, and there's a lot to think about. Would you ask him for world peace? Would you ask, to have one more day with a loved one who's passed away? Would you ask, for the answer to all of life's problems? There's a lot of different things that you could ask for. So you need to just give that some thought. It's a good question to ponder. But when Solomon was asked, he asked God for wisdom, which is interesting because God, again, offered him anything, and he asked for wisdom. Now, personally, wisdom isn't the first thing that I would have thought of. Wisdom is something that we all need. We all would probably admit that we need wisdom, and yet it's not really high on the list for a lot of people. And I think that's because we think we're pretty all right on our own. But Solomon understood that in order to be king after someone like David, in order to be king and lead a people like Israel who's constantly wandering away from God, to lead those people to God, he was going to need a lot of wisdom. So he asked God, and God answered his request and gave him incredible wisdom, a lot of which is recorded in the Bible. Solomon wrote the book, or many of the book of Proverbs. Solomon wrote Song of Solomon, which would obviously be a love poem. He wrote Ecclesiastes. He wrote big sections of the Bible, and we have his thoughts and his words recorded down, and it's wonderful. And we can see that he really had a heart to do things right. He wanted to carry on the work of his father. He, more importantly, wanted to be faithful to God, and he knew that asking for wisdom was going to help him accomplish that. Now, I'm hoping by now you're in 1 Kings chapter 10, and we're going to read in verses 1 through 10, okay? Because this is important. This is the story we're going to be looking at. This is the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon. So starting in verse 1. And when the Queen of Sheba heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. And when she came to Jerusalem with a very great train, with camels that bear spices, and very much gold, and precious stones, and when she came to Solomon, she communed with him of all that was in her heart. And Solomon told her all her questions, and there was not anything hid from the king which he told her not. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all Solomon's wisdom, and the house that had been built, and the meat of his table, and the sitting of his servants, and the attendance of his ministers, and their apparel, and his cupbearers, and his ascent by which he went up into the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. And she said to the king, It was of true report that I heard in my own land, and of the acts and of thy wisdom. Howbeit I believed not the words until I came, and mine eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. Thy wisdom and thy prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard. Happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants which stand continually before thee, and that hear thy wisdom. Blessed be the Lord thy God, which delighteth in thee to set thee on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he thee king to do judgment and justice. So just a short account where essentially what's happening is the Queen of Sheba heard about this guy named Solomon. She heard about this king in a faraway land of Israel who was wise, who was wealthy, whose people were happy, and it seemed too good to be true. Now, how many of you, and you can't raise your hand because I won't know, but how many of you have heard the phrase, too good to be true? My brother always says, and it's a little pessimistic, but he always says, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Now, maybe that is pessimistic, but it's also kind of true. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. You know, an example that I wrote down, a lot of people get scam emails. You know, some guy from another country who needs help transporting like $2 million in rare gems, and all you have to do is like give him your social security number and your bank account information, and he'll send it to you and give you like 50% for helping him. You know, it's too good to be true. That doesn't happen. You know, even at the grocery store, you know, you hear about this super incredible deal. Odds are you read the label wrong, or the price tag wrong, or it was an accident. A lot of things that seem too good to be true are. You know, another example of this is when I was able to go hiking several years ago, and we got to the top, and I've shared this story with a lot of you, but we got to the top, and down the backside of the mountain was just kind of like a big snow slide, and it took you about halfway down the mountain. And so one of the guys I was with decided, you know what, this is going to be a great idea to shave some time off. We'll slide down on our rear ends about halfway down and then walk the trail the rest of the way, and that'll save us a couple of hours worth of hiking. Well, long story short, we lost control. I slammed into a pile of rocks and spun through the air, landed on my rear end. The other guys were trying very hard to stop. One guy dropped his phone. Like, it was a bad idea, okay? I mean, sliding down a mountain on your rear with no real way to control yourself, it's just a terrible idea. Seemed too good to be true, you know? Oh, this nice, easy path down the mountain. No, it's a bad idea. I don't recommend it. It was too good to be true. Now, on the flip side, it's wonderful when we come across something that seems too good to be true, but turns out to actually be legit, or even better than you heard. You know, someone tells you to try this great food because it's the best food they've ever had, or try this restaurant, and you're like, okay, yeah, it'll probably be pretty good. You go and you try it out, and whew, it's even better than you had hoped. Or, you know, hey bro, you need to watch this movie, and they recommend this new movie that came out, and you're like, okay, yeah, it'll probably be pretty good, and like it's your favorite movie because it's just so good. Marriage is an example. You know, I grew up hearing that marriage is great, but honestly, it's one of those things that until you actually experience it for yourself, you don't understand how truly wonderful marriage can be. And so there are a lot of examples of things that seem too good to be true. A lot of times it is too good to be true, but sometimes you come across those things that are even better than you could have hoped for. Bottom line is this: when there's something that seems too good to be true, people talk about it. Whether it's this hot deal or this new movie or talking about how great marriage is going to be someday for you all. When people have those things that seem too good to be true, they love to talk about them. People take note. It catches attention. And so what was happening with Solomon here is his works were building a reputation. Like even from faraway lands, people were hearing about King Solomon and his wisdom and his ability to lead the nation of Israel, and he was doing great things for God. And so this was starting to catch attention. And one specific individual, the queen of a land called Sheba, his testimony captured her attention. And you saw that in the first 5 verses. On the very first verse, you see that the queen of Sheba took note of Solomon. And Sheba was located where modern day Yemen is in southern Arabia. So if you look at a map and you find Yemen, you can basically look at Yemen and then find Israel, and you'll see that it's about 1,500 miles away. So this was a pretty long ways, all right? This wasn't a short drive, especially because they didn't have planes, they didn't have cars or anyway. So everyone's going by caravan or by chariot, and that takes a lot of time. But even given the distance and the time of travel, Solomon's fame was so widespread that he even attracted the attention of this queen. Now, there's a specific reason for that. The works of Solomon attracted the attention of others because they seemed too good to be true. The queen didn't think a man could be so wise and therefore took interest in him. Much the same in our own lives, we ought to live in such a way that people take note. We ought to have a strong testimony where people can see the hand of God in our lives and think, wow, there is something different about that person. Solomon didn't have a reputation for being the world's worst king. He had a reputation for being incredibly wise, having a happy land, being prosperous, things that seemed too good to be true. Now, the Queen of Sheba would have an understanding of some of the problems that came with being royalty the same way that Solomon would, because she was the queen. She helped lead the country, and so she would have understood, that's not normal. This isn't how people respond to royal decrees. This isn't. Most people don't love their, leaders, but the queen decided, I need to see this for myself. I need to see whether or not this is true. And so, even though she heard this testimony, she wasn't content to simply hear the story. She was so curious about the fame of Solomon that she determined to set out whether the rumors were really true. She set out on more than a 1,500-mile journey after loading up caravans with gold, spices, and other goods for trade. She arrived in Israel and she saw things for herself. Now, once arriving in Israel, the queen sat with Solomon and began to see whether what she heard was true. She asked him questions to test his wisdom, and she beheld the splendor of his kingdom. In the days of Israel, contests of riddles or proverbs were often used to test wisdom. If you've ever seen like Lord of the Rings or some medieval style movie like that, a lot of times you'll have like a cave or a temple, and the only way to gain access is to prove your wisdom by giving the right answer to a riddle or something like that. And so even in this day, a lot of times people would sit down and they would give them riddles to see how wise they really were. It's possible that when the Queen of Sheba arrived, that she gave like riddles like this, and she sat down with Solomon. But regardless of how this wisdom was tested, she doubted that anyone could be so accomplished as Solomon, and so she felt need to dispute it. And you need to understand that when you're living for God in your life, there will be times when others will test whether you're genuine. Okay, you will have people test you to see if you're really faithful to God, if you really know your stuff as a Christian. How much of the Bible have you read? What does this verse mean? They want to know if you're taking seriously your role as a Christian. And so it's important that you understand that even now you ought to be building a testimony, you ought to be preparing yourself, because you will be tested by the world. So Solomon was living for God, and his time of testing came. So these are the notes for just kind of the first half of the story. We'll continue looking at this, but this is